For myself and many others, justice for the Armenian genocide is not just about the people who perished or were displaced, but it's also for the memory and legacy of their ancestors immortalized through the stones and monuments they created across our homeland. A physical reminder of the timeless stories of our families and our nation going back many millennia. In other words, the genocide was not only an attempt to eliminate the Armenian people, but also an attempt to destroy the Armenian story, past and future, as if we never existed. Targeting our history, targeting our heritage sites is at the core of what makes it a genocide. Thousands upon thousands of Armenian structures throughout Western Armenia have been reduced to rubble, or at best, a handful of brutally mislabeled tourist sites. Azerbaijan is part of this genocide, the genocide to erase our existence from Armenia and from Artsakh, in the future and the past.
I'm Krista Marina Apardian.
And I'm Haig Minasian.
And you're listening to Haituk Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. Today's episode, Cultural Genocide, the erasure of Armenia's past.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world.
Today's guest is Simon Marakian. Simon Marakian is a political analyst, lecturer, and activist. Previously an Amnesty International specialist, Marakian now also consults on advocacy in 18 Western states for a grassroots Armenian American organization. For over 10 years, Marakian has documented what he considers to be our century's worst yet least known cultural genocide. His work has sparked the creation of films, articles, satellite investigation, and ultimately the launch of Julfa.com, an online museum dedicated to documenting and publicizing the intentional destruction of the largest medieval Armenian cemetery at Julfa, as well as Khachkars and other ancient Armenian monuments. In 2015, he even helped erect a replica of a destroyed Khachkar at Colorado's capital, where he is currently based. In light of UNESCO's failure to investigate, in 2018, Marakian began focusing his research on the Azerbaijani government's destruction of all traces of Armenian culture in Nakhichevan. Upon the recent events in Artsakh, the destruction of Armenian churches and monuments become of particular concern, making Marakian's work that much more vital to preserving our history.
Nakhichevan, a region adjacent to Armenia's southeast, which is part of modern-day Azerbaijan today, has been completely depopulated of its Armenian indigenous population and its cultural heritage, serving as an example of what we feared would be the result in Artsakh. This conversation with Simon took place in October, but since the occupation of lands throughout Artsakh, this work once again becomes especially vital and urgent. Simon, thanks for coming. We're all big fans of your work, and you've been doing great stuff. You are currently in Denver, correct? Colorado?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I have lived in Denver for the past 17 years after immigrating here from Yerevan.
Oh, nice. How is the Armenian community in Denver? I mean, you guys have been doing a lot recently.
Yes, we have an amazing community over the past few weeks. We have had several protests. We got two of the U.S. senators, the first two, and unfortunately so far only outside of the East Coast, to make strong statements in support of Artsakh. We were able to get Lockheed Martin to engage with us, and we're continuing the protest tomorrow because they have not delivered on our asks yet. But we have heard that it's actually moving conversations with the U.S. government on the sanctions front. And historically, this community has been very politically active. We're the first and only state to have a Khachkar on the grounds of our capital. We have the Sardar Abad Armenian Memorial Highway.
Nice.
We had Artsakh recognized last year, and
Amazing.
we had an Armenian candidate run for the state house earlier this year. Unfortunately, he lost ballot access by 3 votes.
I would have voted for you, man. I got to move to Denver.
I know, yalla.
But also, you guys got the Armenian genocide in the curriculum, right? In the education curriculum in Colorado. That was a recent
Oh, yes,
win.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, on the day of today, the taping of this, I'm also a member of the state commission. We're incorporating the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide into the state standards. So it's not only the law now, we're also in the process of implementing the law, which is the hardest part.
Amazing. That's awesome. And so you said 17 years ago you moved from Yerevan, so your roots are from Hayastan?
Yes, I was born in Yerevan to a family of genocide survivors on my dad's side. Direct roots on the father's side are in Urfa. less than a mile from the Saint Surpa Asfatati, the Saint Holy Mother of God Church, in the Marak Olon intersection next to the Bajakche Meidani Cutler Square. That's also where the Yodiach Bayans lived. And I happen to know that information because, as you know, the Urfa self-defense was better organized than in most communities. So there's a map of the self-defense which identifies the family home. On my father's side, going, deeper in the roots, I also have connections in Diyarbakir, in Istanbul, and a Syrian ancestor on that side,
Nice.
who was also killed in the genocide. On my mom's side, they're originally from the Mount Arad area, from Bayaskir.
Mm-hmm.
They moved to Armenia in the 19th century, Eastern Armenia, in what is now Gavar. And on my mom's father's side, I'm from Tavush, and most likely originally from Artsakh. We have an ancestor who was killed when the Bolsheviks took over, and we have lost the history behind, that happened between, but most likely, roots there as well.
Wow.
Like all Armenians, I'm proud of my heritage, but as you may know, I've been involved, with many human rights causes throughout my life so far, and intend to do so. But right now, like every Armenian, I have been living and breathing this genocidal onslaught that we've been going through.
So it sounds like you have Western and Eastern. It's like a classic, I feel like, these days. And so you do have family from Artsakh, let's say 100 years ago, but no family from Nakhichevan, correct? Because that's where your work
a
took
lot
you.
of Armenians from Artsakh were originally from Nakhichevan. They had moved around by Iran Shah in the 17th century, and then the Russians brought some of them back to closer to the Armenian highlands, into the Artsakh area. Who knows where we are? I know all Armenians were indigenous to the Armenian highlands. We have been moved around by tsars and shahs and sultans.
We're even on our own,
So,
It's,
it doesn't matter what part of Armenia that we were indigenous to that land, and that's where our roots are. And I understand why you're asking the question. So no connection to Nakhichevan that I know of.
No, but it's a good point because I always think it's funny when Lebanese and Syrian Armenians go moving back to Armenia, and Turks will be like, oh, they're from the Middle East. So I'm like, look, their heritage is Armenian. They still have a right to Armenian indigenous land, whether their family specifically from Artsakh or Nakhichevan or this or there. So that being said, have you ever been? You never got a chance to go to Nakhichevan, correct?
Not into Nakhichevan. I've been to its southern borders. In 2013, I went to northern Iran across the border. Told my mom I was partying in Yerevan.
Nice.
And she was back, home in Denver. And so I sneaked into Iran with an Armenian passport because the U.S. one would have gotten me in jail. It was at the height of the U.S. sanctions under the Obama administration. The first question I got asked at the airport was if I was a Christian, and I said yes because we are Christian. I'm not very religious, but at that time I felt like it. And the guard mocked Jesus by asking if Jesus is the Son of God. And,
oh, jeez.
I had two competing interests. I wanted to make sure I get in, but second, I don't want to be insulted. And so when you know a little bit about world religions, you can get away with questions like that. And I said yes. Jesus is a prophet for Muslims and Son of God for Christians.
Nice answer. That's an excellent
and
answer.
Looked at him with an angry face, and he was like, "Of course, sir.
Nice.
Welcome to Iran." I was like,
Wow.
"Merci, Barodar, merci."
Yeah, that's great. So, Simon, to talk about, the work that took you there. So, you, as a political science researcher, you've embarked on this journey to document Azerbaijan's ruin of about 28,000 different Armenian monuments, including medieval churches, intricate khachkars, cross stones, and even 22,000 tombstones. So, where do you start when investigating this form of cultural demolition?
Yeah, it's a very complicated project to describe. So I'll actually start from the beginning. December 15, 2005, I'm in the United States. I've lived in this country for 2 years or so, and very much involved in human rights work. I'm watching a video from Armenia that's showing the destruction of the Khachkar back in Nakhichevan, the Julfa or Himjua cemetery that once housed 10,000 medieval khashkars, the world's largest field of intricately carved cross stones. And I was really upset with what was going on. I was hoping the Armenian government would be able to stop it. They did not. I was hoping there would be media outreach. It did not happen. I was hoping that the international community would really be up in arms like they were about the bombing of the Bamiyan Buddhas,
Right.
Which was, really more a justification for the U.S. invasion in Afghanistan. I'm not saying the invasion of Afghanistan was right or wrong, but that's when it actually became. That's when it became news. It actually had happened earlier, but that's when the U.S. government and the corporate media that started using it. So I was under the false, assumption that the world actually cares about human rights violations, and cultural rights violations are human rights violations, as the world is more eager to recognize today. So that really upset me, and it really shook me to my core, because for a long time, I had thought that people who do terrible things, there's some justification for it that can be forgiven, but there was nothing to forgive about destroying monuments on a part of a country that has no room for development. There was absolutely no reason to destroy the world's largest Armenian medieval cemetery. Mm-hmm. And after, a week, I realized that Azerbaijan was denying it, not because they did not know what they were doing. The denial was part of the destruction. Mm-hmm. And as, the descendant of Armenian genocide, actually, I forgot to mention my father's parents were born in Syria, in Aleppo. Mm-hmm. Two families from escaped from Urfa, which I mentioned earlier. So the descendants of the genocide, I'd always thought that, what if, there was more proof that it happened? Was there a way to convince the Turks this really happened? Right. And there are obviously some righteous Turks, but not enough as of now who admit it. And so it really bothered me that Azerbaijan was denying and getting away with it. And I was like, well, there's got to be ways to prove it. It's on videotape. There's so many ways to document it. So it kind of became, in some ways, a mini project for me to do what I could not have done for the Armenian genocide, right? Because it has taken, giants like Vagan Dadarian, Taner Akçam, and so many others to prove that this happened, right? And now there's almost zero academic denial about it, except, those who are directly funded or benefit from Turkish denial. And so it kind of, was the area where I could be useful. So I published articles about it. I eventually convinced the American Association for the Advancement of Science to document it through satellite investigations, which was the pioneer satellite study of a cultural case of human rights violations. Prior to that, it had all been about civilian violations, and it actually became sort of the model of documenting what ISIS later did to monuments.
Very nice.
And so, it became an important cause. I convinced the local Armenian community in Colorado to rebuild one of the 10,000 cross stones on the grounds of the Colorado State Capitol, which was really a monumental undertaking, and Azerbaijan tried really hard to stop it. They were unable to do so. And then in 2018, after getting engaged, 5 days after I got engaged, I couldn't fall asleep because I realized I had made a selective research all this time. I concentrated on the destruction of Julfa, which took place between December 15 and early January, and went on with its cover up for a few more months with the grading of the flat field and the temporary shooting range was placed there. But I realized that all this time I had concentrated on one episode, the grand finale of the destruction of Nakhichevan's entire medieval Armenian heritage, but I neglected the churches and the entire heritage that had been wiped out. Mm-hmm. So I got really upset. I hadn't done enough research. I knew I needed to do more, even though I'd been studying it for over a decade. So I actually sent a pitch to History Today, the world's largest historical magazine. That night, they accepted my proposal. I worked on a draft for a month, and then I brought in my old friend Sarah Pickman, who is my age and who had also helped me create the film, The New Tears of Araxes, about the destruction of the Julfa Cemetery back in 2006. And so she came along for 1 year, day and night. We worked with History Today on this monumental piece that went through hundreds of revisions. We brought in Azerbaijani contributors who remain unnamed. We had peer reviewers, even Tom DeWall, who is somewhat controversial, right? Both in Armenia and Azerbaijan, because he's sometimes overtly objective and pisses people off. Sometimes, he makes me upset too when he kind of overlooks the genocidal intent of what Azerbaijan is doing against Armenians. But he is the best non-Armenian scholar of the subject. So even,
the most trusted.
He got to review it.
Yeah.
And History Today, something happened. I don't know what. They changed their mind. They did not publish it.
Do you think they got pressure from foreign governments?
Yeah, they started understanding the monumental nature of the piece, that this was, something groundbreaking and potentially controversial. It was never controversial because every word, every comma, every fact in it is incredibly correct and verified. And so Herak Varsanyan, the editor of Hyperallergic magazine, he had known of my work. I talked to him and he agreed to publish it.
Yeah, I've read that article. It's great.
Yeah.
The Julfa destruction of this, huge cemetery, it was not just in 2005, right? It was building up to it. They maybe had damaged it beforehand. What's the timeline on that, on the demolition?
Right. So the timeline of Julfa's destruction is very much similar to the timeline of the cultural genocide that took place in Nakhichevan. It started in about late May 1997 with the churches most likely in Agulis, which was an amazing Armenian town. For some reason, we don't know so much about it. But Agulis at some point had 12 churches. 8 of them survived through the Soviet era. And those beautiful medieval churches, some of them, dating to the first century when they were founded as chapels by the apostles. In late May, early June 1997, their destruction started. And we know this because the amazing Azerbaijani humanist author, Aktham Aylisli, he sent a telegraph to the president of Azerbaijan protesting the destruction. And a few years ago, he publicized that information in the Russian version of his famous book, Stone Dream. It was only published in 50 copies. And later, and last year, I was given a digital copy of his communication, and that's how I know. And the Julfa destruction did not happen the same year. It started in 1998. There were some international protests. It stopped. They resumed in 2002 to 2003. There was some international protests. It stopped. And in 2005, after Ilham Aliyev came to power, replaced his father, and after he opened the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, he felt emboldened to finish off the cultural genocide that his father had not been able to. So December 5, 2005, or December 6, 2005, the Aliyev representative in Nakhichevan, Vasif Talibov, gave an order for the final destruction of everything that remained. Not just Julfa, but they went through every single stone
anything Armenian
in Nakhichevan. Yeah, and they had a deadline. December 31st, 2006 was the deadline to finish off that project.
So it's an official policy of Azerbaijan to do this cultural genocide, basically, remove Armenian heritage. Is it under
in Nakhichevan? In Nakhichevan in particular, yes. I cannot claim the same for the entire state of Azerbaijan because we are not indigenous to Baku, right? It's not part of the original Armenian homeland. So the areas, the original Armenian highlands that are under Azerbaijani occupation, Nakhichevan in particular, every single stone of Armenian heritage has been wiped out. It has no precedent in any part of the world, not even in Turkey. We know Turkey has destroyed close to 2,000 Armenian monuments, but some ruins remain, and some churches have been even repaired, for propaganda purposes. What has happened in Nakhichevan is unprecedented by any scale of modern or anything that it's inconceivable. And to be honest, a lot of Armenians are still processing. It took myself 10 years, right, to process the enormity of that crime.
Right.
And that's why I was probably so concentrated with Julfa. And even today, when I give interviews, when I talk to Armenian media, Armenian audiences, they're like, oh, Simon is talking about the Khachkars. I'm like, no, I'm not only talking about the Khachkars of Julfa. We're talking about 89 medieval churches that had survived earthquakes, Khaled, Sultan, Stalin. We're talking about 5,840 cross stones most of them in Jufa, but also across the region. And we're talking about 22,000 tombstones, the flat gravestones, many of them in Jufa, but most of them not in that particular area across the Nafi Javan. Every single one has been destroyed, and it was done between 1997 and 2006.
Damn. I mean, it really does connect for me with how Turkey's kind of erased our heritage and our monuments there, and then what Azerbaijan's doing. Again, for me, it connects the two parties there. Do you know, real fast, what's the policy of the rest of Azerbaijan with Armenian monuments, even if it's not indigenous parts, but are there still active churches, or are they removing it there as well?
No, there's no active Armenian churches. There's one Armenian church in Baku out of the original three that has survived. It's actually the one that was built most recently in the 19th century. They have kept it as a library, for obvious token propaganda purposes. So those who go on the Baku's, Disneyland propaganda tours are shown that church as a token, as a beacon of Azerbaijani tolerance. There is an Armenian church building in Ganja, the second largest city, that has survived. And there are Armenian ruins in other parts of Azerbaijan that have not necessarily been completely destroyed, in part because there is another Christian minority in Azerbaijan, the Udi, and Azerbaijan says that those churches belong to Udi. So like in 2005, there were Armenian churches in the Udi populated areas where the inscriptions were polished off and they were rebranded as Udi churches.
Udi is Caucasian Albanians, right? Or they're connected to maybe them as like the descendants?
Yes, most likely the Udis are the direct descendants of the Alkhavan or the Caucasian Albanians.
Yeah.
Although that's not necessarily a scientifically accepted reality, but most likely they are directly related.
Yeah.
Armenians are related to Caucasian Albanians were a brother nation of Armenians.
Very close, yeah.
Many of them, when after the conquest, they assimilated with the Armenian nation, and as have other ethnicities that have throughout the thousands of years assimilated with Armenians. Caucasian Albanians are one of them. Some of them were forced, the leftovers were forced to become Turkic at some point.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this is maybe why we have common DNA with Azerbaijanis might be through the Caucasian Albanians.
Well, something in particular about the Caucasian Albanians is they use the same alphabet as us or something very similar, and they're also apostolic in the sense that our churches were connected. This is like thousands of years ago, but there is a close cultural connection there.
Their alphabet was most likely created by Mesrop Mashtos, who also created the Armenian and the Georgian alphabet. As much as the Georgians hate that fact, I really don't know why they're so upset. And so that script was discovered. There are two sources for the Caucasian Albanian script. There's an Armenian manuscript in Matenadaran in Yerevan, and there's a Coptic manuscript, Coptic Egyptian manuscript that has information on the Caucasian Albanian alphabet. And I think it was the 7th century. They basically disappeared as people. Yes, they were like a mini Armenian kingdom that was eventually absorbed into Armenia because they just could not survive the conquest through the century.
Speaking of certain different aspects of culture disappearing, Simon, can you talk a little bit about Azerbaijan's cultural and historical revisionism and maybe why it's dangerous for us long term?
Well, so Armenians see our monuments, as proof of our existence. We don't see ourselves and the monuments separate. In the Artsakh War, when people will ask, well, why aren't Armenians, evacuating Khachkars? Well, we and the people in the Khachkars are the same. And so Armenians are staying and fighting for their survival, not just for their families, but also the vast heritage. There are about 4,000 Armenian cultural sites in the territory of the Artsakh Republic. And as the November 2020 issue of the Art newspaper documents in one of their front page stories, all of them are under danger in case of Azerbaijan's success in their conquest.
Yeah.
Right.
It is important. I mean, there's two French authors whose names escape me, but they're in the hyperallergic piece. They have said that Armenia's oppressors, target Armenian monuments because those are the monuments those are the most direct. Those are the most direct relationships that Armenians have with their ancestry. So the monuments for us are in some ways our ancestors,
Of course.
and our connection to the land. And as the indigenous people of that land, when we're targeted, our monuments are also part of that targeting process.
Well, Azerbaijan and the Azeri population of Azerbaijan, their version of Armenian history is distorted, right? It's been revised, and would you agree that there's a policy of revising the history of the region, and then it's interesting when they come across these actual monuments, what are they thinking? But
right, so there is the historiography in Azerbaijan is a state-controlled narrative. It actually started in the Soviet era in the 60s, actually in the 50s, if you go back. So after the Stalinist era was shaking up, and there was the thaw or the de-Stalinization that happened in the Soviet Union starting in the mid-1950s, Armenians became, more open about our culture, and we wanted to reclaim our cultural roots, and that was also the case in Artsakh and in other parts of the Armenian highlands. And so, in response, Azerbaijan's Soviet authorities wanted to counter Armenian and Georgian claims to antiquity, and so they started, finding reasons to justify the presence of thousands of Christian indigenous monuments on the territory of Soviet Azerbaijan. And so they started, those are not Georgian monuments, they're not Armenian monuments, they're Caucasian Albanian monuments, that are the direct ancestors of the Azerbaijanis. So they're for our monuments, and Armenians and Georgians have no claim to that. And so the monuments of Artsakh, the Christian monuments in Azerbaijan's propaganda, are called they're called Albanian monuments.
yeah,
Now, if there's anyone listening who has hope that in the genocidal event of Azerbaijan taking over parts of Artsakh, that at least the monuments will be preserved as Caucasian Albanian.
yeah,
You should not have a lot of hope for that, because the same thing happened in Nakhichevan. In the 80s and 90s, they convinced the local population that the entire medieval Christian heritage of Nakhichevan was not Armenian, it was Caucasian Albanian, right? So the people in Nakhichevan saw that as part of their heritage. They were, in some ways, worshipping those churches in a way that Armenians do. And to be honest, a lot of Azeris in Nakhichevan are forcefully converted Islamized Armenians,
probably.
and some of them know that. So they were actually, they were using the Albanian argument as a justification to continue worshipping those churches. I'm not saying worshipping at those churches, worshipping the churches, because we do both, right? So, and then 1997, the very monuments that were used for field trips in Nakhichevan, the very monuments that were told were their own heritage, they started bombarding them, and by end of 2006, none of them remained.
So if Azerbaijan takes over Artsakh, you think the same thing will kind of happen there? Something similar?
If not right away, eventually will, under the current regime.
Yeah.
However, they are trying to get an independent status for the Udi Christians, because Udi Christians are still technically part of the Armenian Church, even though they have to officially hate Armenians, right? Because that's the only way they can survive. The minority in Azerbaijan is to hate Armenians more than the Azeri government does. And so they have actually applied to the Greek patriarch in Istanbul, in Constantinople, who kind of lives, under Turkish pressure and has to collaborate with the Turkish government. So they're trying to get an independent Orthodox status of Udi Christians. I assume in the event of them being able to conquer and commit a genocide against Armenians in Artsakh, they're hoping to declare Udis as the indigenous Christians of Artsakh, move them in. But that is probably more done as a justification for some of the Azerbaijanis who may still care about the Christian monuments and be like, we'll just find a way to preserve them. I highly doubt that would happen, at least, from what we've seen in Nakhichevan. And, so when we say this is a genocide of Armenians when Azerbaijan tried to conquer Artsakh, it's not a dramatization of what's going on. They really mean that. And as we saw the shelling of the Shusha Cathedral on October the 8th, Azerbaijan has no regard for sacredness, as we saw in bombardment, the targeted bombardment of the Children's Hospital in Stepanakert on October 28th. Azerbaijan has no regard for anything sacred or anything civilian. And I say targeted. It's not the same when Armenia has to fight back and civilians are hurt. Azerbaijan is using Bayraktar combat drones and F-16 Lockheed Martin jets that have very specific targeted
accurate
areas. It's not the same as cluster bombs that you sometimes use against military subjects when they hit civilians.
Right. So, Simon, one of the reasons that we're able to look at these cross tones and we have photos of them, right? One of the reasons we do have documentation is because of Argam Ayvazyan, right?
Yes.
And so he was a photojournalist and researcher who was sort of foundational in recording these monuments in Nakhichevan before the Soviet Union's collapse. And it's almost like he, helped predict that they would be destroyed. And it's also almost as though you kind of carried on his work in a way. I'm curious to know if you knew each other, if you spoke to him before or throughout your research.
Yeah, of course. I've known Argam Ayvazyan for many, many years. He is a senior friend, someone I look up to. As you said, he was both a researcher and a photographer and a prophet in some sense, because he foresaw the destruction of the monuments, and that's why he spent decades and decades and decades documenting every stone in Nakhichevan. I think a lot of people underappreciate the risks that he took, the sacrifices that he made toward his family, and we really owe it to Argam Ayvazyan and Argam Ayvazyan alone for the monumental work that he did in documenting. Of course, there are other photographs, there are researchers as early as 1915, like Aram Barud, who did wonderful photography at Tufa, and others who also visited, occasionally, but they did not spend years, let alone decades. A lot of people who just went in for a couple of days, took the photos, and they left. Some would not even take photos. My father visited Tufa as a young to middle-aged man with his friends, and they were not allowed to take photographs, right? But Argam Ayvazyan spent most of his life documenting the monuments, and he, not just the Armenian ones, the Islamic ones too. No one knows the monuments of Nakhichevan better than he does. I am not an expert on the monuments. My work is research and political documentation of the destruction that took place from 1997 to 2006 and the subsequent and ongoing denial of that crime. So my work is based on the documentation. So when I say 89 medieval churches, 5,840 cross stones, and 22,000 tombstones were destroyed, those are not numbers that I have collected myself. That's the documentation of what Argam Ayvazyan collected. Most likely there were more monuments that were destroyed because Azerbaijan used its resources on a national level to find out everything that existed. And there is a chance that in his decades of work, Argam Ayvazyan may not have had access to certain military areas where other monuments existed. So we're talking about the lower end number of monuments. And also Azerbaijan destroyed some questionable monuments. If they were not sure if something was a church or maybe a Buddhist tomb left by the Mongols before they converted to Islam, the Ilkhanis, they probably destroyed. In fact, I have an Azerbaijani colleague who argues that they destroyed an amazing Buddhist Mongol tomb because they thought it was Armenian. They took the safe route.
Have you seen this happen to other minorities in Azerbaijan, other than the Udi, but like the Lezgin and the Talish? Anything like this for them?
I've not done enough research to make a comparison.
I don't know if they have enough stones and stuff.
Yeah, I would highly doubt that. But in Nakhichevan, in tandem with the cultural erasure of the historical physical landscape that has happened, they have not only erased the Armenian history in their historiography, they have also Islamized the diverse conquests that took place of Nakhichevan. So, for example, they won't talk about the Arabs, the Mongols, the Seljuks, and others that came and conquered and left their physical heritage. They talk about all of that as Islamic Turkish heritage. And another interesting factor, and most notably the Persian, right? The Persian conquest and colonization and the Persian heritage of Nakhichevan. they will never acknowledge that. They only talk about the Islamic Turkish heritage, about all of those monuments. And very interestingly, now Azerbaijanis, they say that they're more complex. They're not just Turks like Armenians and others will call them. But in official documents, the Nakhijevani Azerbaijanis are called Azerbaijani Turks. They're not called Azerbaijanis. So Azerbaijan has gone out of its way to Turkify Nakhichevan. I don't know if this was done to impress Turkey. I don't know if because they fear Turkey wants to take Nakhichevan, because under the 1921 Treaty of Kars, Moscow is under Turkish protectorate. So it wasn't just to wipe off the Armenian heritage because they fear Armenians may one day take it back. Right? Kind of a ridiculous statement. There might have been some fear of Turkish invasion of Nakhichevan one day. So they wanted to outdo the Turks in their anti-Armenian, anti-minority stance.
Simon, when Argam was taking these photos in the Soviet Union time, what was happening to the Armenian population of Nakhichevan at that point? Were there not a lot left in Nakhichevan, and why is that?
So yeah, he was one of the last Armenians of Nakhichevan. He was born and raised in Nakhichevan. He moved to Yerevan, but his family stayed there. When Nakhichevan was placed under Soviet Azerbaijan's rule, under pressure from Ataturk, and Lenin and Stalin thought that if they were nice to Ataturk, maybe Turkey would become socialist and join the Soviet Union. So they went out of their way to make sure that Nakhichevan would become part of Soviet Azerbaijan, even though almost half of the population was Armenian, and many of the Muslim Nakhichevanis were forcefully converted Armenians. There are entire villages in Nakhichevan. So there are a lot of Islamized Armenians in Nakhichevan today who probably hate Armenians more, right? Because when you're forced to change your ethnicity, you become, worse of a nationalist than the actual Turks.
You have to prove it.
So,
whatever,
right. So the Armenian population was forced out in a slow motion ethnic cleansing in the Soviet era. They were discriminated against. They were not allowed to have decent jobs. They were not allowed to have any functional Armenian churches. They were not allowed to have Armenian schools. So the conditions were such where they were forced to leave. And Heydar Aliyev, who was the KGB leader of Nakhichevan from the early 60s, he was the man in charge of this. And he actually had an encounter with Argam Ayvazyan in 1965, in which he ran into Argam in a KGB station after Argam was picked off as a child.
Wait. So Ilham Aliyev's dad, who was in the KGB, and he met the Argam, the photographer, stopped him?
Yes.
That's crazy.
In 1965, I know it's an unbelievable story. I have talked about this with Argam Ayvazyan for 3 days. I interrogated him basically, right? Because it could be a story that, someone might make it up because it's a cool story. It's not a cool story. It's a very
surreal,
well-documented story. And he told me, I have I can tell you everything that happened. Even one of the Azerbaijani reviewers of the hyperallergic piece, he was like, dude, take this out. It just sounds too unreal. And I was like, I had to sit him or her down. I don't want to say the name. So I said him or her down and told the story. I was like, this is how it happened. And he's like, he or she. Yeah. Okay, this makes sense now. You should leave it in. Yeah, so he runs into Heydar Aliyev. He has no idea who Heydar is at the time. He gets picked up for taking photos of a church near his birthplace, goes to a KGB station. And Heydar Aliyev at the time was chief of second or first in command of Azerbaijan's KGB. He was visiting. He was on a duty back in his home region of Nakhichevan. And they're like, what is this teenager here? Like, what did he do? Was it drunk? Like, no, he was taking church photos. So they take, he was like, okay, kid, let's have tea. So he calls him in for tea. And he's like, so why are you taking photos of churches? He's like, well, I'm Armenian. So there are Armenian churches. I was just taking photos for fun. And he's like, Heydar got very upset. And he said, there are no Armenian Shmarmenian things here.
Armenian Shmarmia?
Don't take.
Armenian
Shmarmenian things. Yeah. Don't. I forget how the Russian part sounds, but he said it in Russian.
That's crazy.
And so that was his first warning not to take photos. He was a kid. Imagine being a kid being told by a powerful person, don't do this. and he continued. So I wonder if in some ways it actually that inspired him because as a teenager, right? It's like,
Right.
how dare you tell me not to take photos of the churches? And he just spent the next several decades going back and back and back until 1989. I think was his last visit, 87 or 89.
And Haydar's the same guy who 30 years later,
Right.
instituted the
Became
the
president
destruction
and
of
carried all this
everything.
out. Yeah, exactly.
And the Aliyevs are from Nakhichevan, right? That's where their home region is, the Aliyev family.
Yes, they claim so, even though Haydar Aliyev was born on the territory of the Republic of Armenia in Sunik, but they quickly moved to Nakhichevan, and so they're considered the Nakhichevan clan,
Yeah.
and so a lot of their political power and clout comes from Nakhichevan, even though the Pashayev family, which is a family that Aliyev married into, is trying to actually take power away from Ilham Aliyev, and the war in Artsakh has been arguably one of the reasons why Aliyev, he wanted to impress his wife's family and prove that he deserves to stick to power instead of transferring it to either his wife or his son or one of the two daughters.
I didn't know that's how it still worked there. That's crazy.
Yeah, that is wild. So, Simon, of course, these monuments are spiritual and are ingrained with our culture, and their destruction goes well beyond physical ruin, of course. The destruction of these monuments represents many things, right? As you mentioned, it represents a destruction of some sort of tie to our ancestral family. It represents, losing a physical piece of our history as well as non-physical. It also represents a shift in the ownership of our land. But we see this in Turkey, as we mentioned earlier, although there are some, there are some differences and a couple ruins that do still stand in Turkey. I'm curious, what are some parallels and maybe differences as well between Azerbaijani monument destruction and that in Turkey?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. In general, cultural destruction is horror projection. Right, we've seen ISIS do this to Assyrians, Yazidis, and Kurds, and others in the Middle East. We saw the Taliban do this to the remnants of the Buddhist Mongols in Afghanistan. We have seen, white settlers do this in the United States, especially in the beginning, either destruction or, myth creation that those were. Like Mesa Verde in Colorado, they said was built by Europeans because, savages had no ability or imagination to build an amazing civilization. We've seen this throughout history. The first one recorded in Armenian history is in the 8th century before Common Era, when the Neo-Assyrians attacked the temple of Musasir, which by then has been in existence for about 150 years, and it was destroyed. And Sargon II, if I'm not mistaken, the Neo-Assyrian king, proudly made a note of how he destroyed the Urartian temple. And I know not everyone agrees that, Urartians were necessarily Armenian. However, toward the end of Urartu, at the time when the destruction happened, Armenia and Urartu were used interchangeably, as we saw later in the Persian inscriptions. So that was the first mention, and then we had, of course, when Armenia became Christian, there was destruction of the pagan heritage, right? We need to acknowledge that. Of course, in some times there were exceptions, like the Garni temple was preserved, the Echmiadzin fireplace was preserved, as we found out 50 years ago in the 1950s, I guess 70 years ago, during the renovations, they found the pagan fireplace, the worship place, under the basement. But, that was for different reasons. That was not done to erase the Armenian, existence. It was done to redefine Armenian existence in a way that, became very, heavily influential in our cultural awareness and culture, in the way we built our culture. So the Arabs show up. They were the first major colonizers after Christianity was adopted in Armenia. And there was destruction, not only destruction of churches, Armenians were not allowed to build churches, let alone khachkars or cross stones. Major example was in the early 8th century when an Armenian church in Nakhichevan was burned along with hundreds of Armenian noblemen. in the Holy Trinity Church. And then when the Seljuk Turks started invading the Armenian homeland, there were also mass burning of churches. There was the Bagabert in the 12th century, Bagabert Castle, where 10,000 Armenian manuscripts were saved. This is now in the territory of the Republic of Armenia in Tunik. The Seljuk Turks set them to ablaze. And this continued throughout the century. And of course, in 1915, when the Armenian genocide started, Turkey adopted an official policy of targeting the churches as part of the destruction. And they had an inspiration from the 1895 Holocaust of Urfa. Urfa was the hometown of my ancestors, as I mentioned, also a hometown of biblical Abraham. And in Urfa, the large Armenian cathedral there, in 1895, 3,000 Armenians, mostly women and children, took refuge there, thinking that Turks would not dare, touch their sacredness. And they set the church to fire from all the entrances. And so all 3,000 Armenians were burned alive inside the church. That's why it's called the Urfa Holocaust. And so building on that, in 1915, the Turkish government started targeting Armenian churches. And it continued throughout the years, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s. There were mass destruction, but it never got to the point where they destroyed every single piece, which is kind of impossible. There's so much Armenian heritage in Turkey. There'll always be something left. And so, Nakhichevan, the Azeri authorities there, I think, they wanted to impress in some ways the Turks to do something much worse. There's actually a new theory that I've been pondering. I need to do some more research on this if I ever end up writing a book on the subject, or actually, spending time. Just, this
I'd love
is
to hear
irrelevant,
it.
but just so you know,
I'd love to hear it.
Just so you know, the 10 years I've spent, 10, 13 years on the research, I've done it on my own time, on my own dime. Even though I'm affiliated with the University of Colorado, with other academic institutions, I've worked for Amnesty International. I have also currently, a part-time paid affiliation with the ANCA. None of those organizations have ever been involved in the funding of my research. It has been free, just like Aga Mayvazyan. He spent his entire life. He got a grant once from the Soviet government, Armenian government, to do research. And sometimes people will say, but he was paid at some point. I'm like, yes, like for a week-long mission out of like 3 decades of work, that doesn't count. The Turkish influence is enormous in what happened in Nakhichevan. The Turkish influence is enormous over Azerbaijan. It's really Turkey that's pushing Azerbaijan into the pan-Turkic aspirations that it has. And it's, Erdogan was not a pan-Turkist to start with. He just wanted to come to power. He was a moderate Islamist, as you may recall, in the early 2000s. And then he realized that the best way to stay in power and expand his power is to go full crazy, nationalist, fascist, and that's what we're seeing right now.
With the destruction of these ruins, there's a sense of permanence. There's a sense of not being able to go back in time, of course, and like Western Armenia or Nakhichevan, we can't get these monuments back, and we can't go back to visit these lands that hosted them. In pursuing justice for this strain of cultural genocide, where does one begin? How do we, prevent this in the future? How do we start in pursuing justice for something like this?
That's a very good question. There's, 3 ways of pursuing justice, in my view. One is working, within the legal framework that exists. Some people work outside, against the system, right? They take extreme measures to achieve justice. And there's a third way where, you say, well, there's no system that can be trusted, and there's no point of being violent against the system. So there's a system of working out, outside the system, not within, not against it, but outside. I think what I have been personally part of, and many communities, but especially the Colorado community part of it, is working in some ways outside the system. We couldn't achieve justice for the cultural genocide in this community. So, we decided to undo the destruction, because the idea of the destruction was to erase. The idea of the destruction, to say those monuments never existed, right? It was an erasure in so many ways. And so we thought we would rebuild. one of the monuments on a prominent ground in the United States as a way to say, this is our response. You will destroy. We may never be able to have any of the monuments repaired on the territory of Nakhchivan. We may never be able to take it to an international court. I've tried in some ways, but this is what we'll do. We will rebuild what you destroy in one way or another, whether it's in situ, meaning on site in archaeological terms, or on the grounds of the Colorado State Capitol.
Right.
Of course, we engage the system to do that, but that's not the same system I was talking about for getting to.
Simon, where else could we see? Aren't there some Khachkars that survived? Maybe they were moved beforehand. Where could an Armenian go see one of these Julfa Khachkars?
There's a couple of dozen that were taken out of the cemetery, especially during the Soviet era. There are some in an ethnographic museum in Tbilisi, Georgia, which, by the way, Azerbaijan tried to confiscate, saying this is from our territory, so let's take them and cut them into pieces. Thankfully, Georgia, one of the few instances where Georgia acted like,
finally,
decent neighbor of Armenia. There are several in Echmiadzin, Holy See Cathedral in Armenia. There are some in museums. There was a temporary one at the Met in New York that was brought from Armenia.
Wow.
But yeah, probably Echmiadzin is the best place to see them. The replicas, some of them are really good, like the Colorado one. There's also replicas in other parts of the world. And the photos also exist. And in some ways, even though not directly from there, but Khachkars in general, even though each and every Khachkar is unique in its design, in some ways they are, they're interconnected. So if anyone sees a Khachkar, they should see that in those Khachkars, the heritage carried by what was lost to Julfa. And just to make one off remark about Khachkars in general, as you know, we don't just worship at our sacred sites as Armenians. We worship our sacred sites, right? It is a very indigenous, right, pagan way. Even though we're the first Christian nation, we do that. It's undeniable. Once a church is always a church. We're not like Americans who will, convert a church to a nightclub and go dirty dance in front of frescoes of Jesus, which happens in Denver. There is a club literally called the church. And it has Christian frescoes, right? That's unimaginable for us. So the Khachkars, they actually did, it was kind of like a Protestant movement, because Khachkars allowed Armenians to avoid the church system. If you wanted to pray by yourself, right, you have a direct connection to God. So in some ways, Khachkars gave autonomy to Armenian Christians to not have to necessarily go to church service. And that's not my theory. I've heard others say that or suggest
I like that
individuality of that.
That's interesting.
But, so Khachkars are sort of our direct connection to both God and to our ancestors. And even atheist Armenians worship Khachkars, right? Because we see them, our history, our roots, our existence.
There's the Vishabakars, which are like the predecessor, right? Like if you go to Armenia, there's a big park and they have these old Vishabakars, which translates to like dragon rocks.
Yeah, they were originally placed at sources of water to protect them from other demons. And they're some of the earliest Khachkars from like the 4th, 3rd century. They are carved on Vishabakars. You've probably seen, some of that.
The transition.
And, and I'm not a Khachkar expert. As I said, I'm a political scientist. I teach international relations.
Just
human rights specialist. But if you want to learn about Khachkars, the best specialist is Hamlet Petrosyan, and he has a book called The Khachkar. And it's really a monumental study, and he's also the main archaeologist of Tigranakert, the 2,000-year-old Hellenistic Armenian city in Artsakh. And, he has been my point of contact in the homeland in terms of giving me information about the monuments and what's going on. Some of that information I'm not at liberty to disclose. But when I say that 4,000 cultural sites are in danger in Artsakh, that's not an understatement. That is the reality, and that's the reality of Armenian existence in our shrinking Armenian highlands, where we've been oppressed and pushed into borders.
Definitely.
It's a very
for
contemporary
centuries,
thing.
and this is why it's such a big fight for us. You guys know that, but we need to convey this to others. So I hope that maybe this message will get to some.
That's what this is about.
Yeah.
It's important for all of us to learn about Julfa and everything in between.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned earlier, Simon, the goal of this cultural demolition is erasure, but your work has helped to prevent that erasure and sort of rewrite some of it as well. So thank you so much for chatting with us today.
So much respect, Simon. Good
Yes.
stuff,
Thank you. Yeah, and I didn't do it for anyone. I did it for me so I could, sleep better. Because at night, I mentioned I couldn't fall asleep after I got engaged. Because I was like, if I don't do this, who will?
Yeah.
And the answer was no one.
Yeah,
and it's
true.
not just doing it; it's doing it right, and making sure that no one can ever refute a single word you've written on the subject.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And that has been the case so far, and will stay so.
Well, I'm looking forward to visiting Denver and seeing the Khachkar, the Julfa Khachkar
Yes,
that you
it's
guys
on the
made
bucket
there.
list,
I'm
for
very
sure.
down. I'm actually very excited about it. But
I would love that. Unfortunately, it was vandalized.
Simon-
We'll rebuild.
We will, absolutely.
That's the motto. We will rebuild.
That's right. On that note, Simon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on.
And have a great night. We'll talk to you soon.
Alrighty.
The honest reality is, without the work of researchers and activists like Argham Ayvazyan carried on by Simon Marrakyan, we would not have a record of Nakhichevan's Armenian past, our thousands of Khachkars and beautiful structures. If not for us, no one would have taken that initiative. With the repeated displacement from our native lands comes the forced abandonment of not only our homes, but also the monuments which make those lands our home.
Marrakyan predicts Azerbaijan will erase thousands of medieval Khachkars, plus several dozen lesser-known churches, especially in the Hadrut area, marking significant erasure early on and eventually either full erasure or renovation of some major Armenian churches to fit the Azeri narrative. Since our conversation in October, Marrakyan's predictions have already proven true, as we've already begun to see both the desecration of Armenian cemeteries and monuments and the subsequent revisionism of our history. Marrakyan intends to continue this research and fight against cultural genocide as Artsak's fate unfolds.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Haituk Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. I'm Krista Marina Apardian.
And I'm Haig Minasyan,
And we're just a couple of Armenians.
talking in the world.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world. Go ahead. Try to destroy them.